Mike Wheeler. We're here at the Alexandria Mark Center campus of the Institute for Defense Analyses talking with General Larry Welch about the nuclear age and issues associated with it. To begin with, why don't I go over your biography? Because you've really done a lot of fascinating things, and I think it would set the stage for what we'll be discussing. You were born in 1934 in the panhandle of Oklahoma. You lived a fairly nomadic childhood. Your dad had to chase the work because it was the Depression. So you moved back and forth between Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas. You were in Liberal, Kansas by 1950 to finish high school. And at the end of your junior year, you were invited to join the Army National Guard. You were one of three students that was selected, and you did, in addition to going to high school. So you were in the Army for a while, in the artillery. When you graduated in 1952, you went to college several places. You weren't quite sure what you wanted to do. The draft was looming. This was the Korean War era. And so you decided you would enlist in the Air Force, which you did. And in 1953, you enlisted and went to basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. You completed basic training. You were assigned to technical school at Lowry Air Force Base, Colorado, but you had to wait several months before you'd be able to go there. And so in that kind of a position, you were basically made an assistant tactical instructor for that period of time. And as I understand from discussing with you earlier, one day you took a group of the basics to the base theater, and they were going to see have a talk, a briefing on the Aviation Cadet Program, which is a new program the Air Force had. And so you heard about the Aviation Cadet Program. You didn't follow up, but you got a call a while later asking if you'd be interested in applying for that. And so you did. You took the tests. And as a result, you went through a brief training period for officer training, 3 months as I recall, and then 12 months pilot training at Williams Air Force Base. And you received your pilot wings and were commissioned to second lieutenant in 1955. The most sought after positions were the TAC fighter positions, and you got one of those four, but you were unlucky in the sense that you were assigned to the F-84 about the time it was grounded. So here you are. You could have gotten into TAC fighters at that time. Circumstances prohibited it. So instead you became an Air Force first assignment instructor pilot. The Air Force was expanding the number of pilots it had, and so it had this first assignment instructor program. For the next 7 years, you basically did that kind of thing. As a first lieutenant, you went to Stanaval, a position that was normally a captain's position, and reorganized the base Stanaval. You became the Air Training Command Stanaval. And at the end of 7 years, you also were the project officer for the T-38 Talon. Fairly significant. I mean, here we are in 2016. The Air Force is about to try to replace the T-38. It's been the primary aircraft we use to train Air Force pilots for more than 50 years now. By the end of the 1950s, the Berlin crisis is heating up. And the National Guard is recalled, but then the crisis dies down. So the Air Force has the airplanes, but the National Guard not to fly them. So about this time, you get an assignment to an operational wing, the 366 TAC fighter wing. It's not immediately a flying assignment. You're given the challenge to build a combat operations center, which was a new concept at the time. So again, you do something from scratch. So you had 6 months to do it for the wing to pass its NATO tactical evaluation, and you did that. And at that point, you were selected for the last F-84 unit. You checked out in the F-84. You were going to go to France. This was about the time that General de Gaulle demanded that the United States close its bases in France. So instead of rotating to France, you went with your family to Holloman Air Force Base in southern New Mexico. And while you were at Holloman, the unit transitioned from the F-84 to the F-4. Now, there was a lot of rotational duty in those days, and you were about midway through a 120-day assignment in Alaska. And as I understand the circumstances, it basically was that the F-106, which was our primary interceptor in Alaska, couldn't operate in the winter from many of the Alaskan bases, so the F-4s would go up there in rotational assignment. And you were chasing Soviet bears, basically, as they tried to challenge American airspace. And halfway through your assignment, you suddenly get orders to return, drop your aircraft off at Hill Air Force Base so it could get camouflage paint. The Vietnam War is on. And you go into South Vietnam with the F-4s. You spend a period of time in South Vietnam. You fly 137 combat missions. You move up to be the director of operations of the 366th TAC Fighter Wing at Da Nang. Instead of, when your tour was over, going directly back to Holloman, you're selected to go to Norfolk to Armed Forces Staff College, a 6-month course. And what you find when you finish that course is that one of your squadron commanders at Holloman had approached the Air Staff, Air Force Studies and Analysis, and told them basically that the person they needed to recruit to build the integrated concept for setting the simulations for setting the parameters for what was the primary new TAC fighter program in those days, the FX, which became the F-15, was Larry Welch. And so you go to Air Force Studies and Analysis. And you do so well there building that and doing other kinds of things that they basically put off 2 cycles of assignments. So you're a major, a lieutenant colonel, and a colonel there. Now, while you're at Air Force Studies and Analysis, you also finally complete your bachelor's degree. You do it at the University of Maryland. You're selected to go to National War College. You enter National War College. You also, in your spare time, do a master's degree in international relations at George Washington University. And at the end of National War College, the colonel's group calls you and asks, what would you want to do? What would your preference be? And you said, I want to be a director of operations in the TAC wing. And so they send you to George Air Force Base, California. Now, it turns out to be a very interesting assignment in the sense that you had 5 models of the F-4 there. You had American, German, and Japanese pilots that were training on it. You had the F-105 Wild Weasel. You had 4 ops and 4 training squadrons, and you end up being the vice commander of the 35th TAC Fighter Wing. Now, while you're there, you get a phone call from General Dixon, who's the commander of Tactical Air Command. You've never met General Dixon, but basically, and he's a man of few words, so he doesn't give you context or explain. He just says something like, Welch, I'm going to be at Cannon Air Force Base on such and such a day at such and such a time. You be there. I want to talk to you. So you fly to Cannon, you meet with General Dixon, and you find that what he wants you to do is to put together the first F-15 wing. But he can't immediately assign you to doing that because it's going to be about a year before that can happen. So instead, what he wants you to do is come to Tactical Air Command Headquarters as a special assistant and put together an integrated operations concept for TAC Air. So you do that. Toward the end of that period of time, the first fighter wing is available. You go to the first fighter wing, and within 12 months of doing that, you have 100 F-15s on the rank. You are promoted to Brigadier General. General Dixon brings you back to TAC headquarters as the Inspector General. There's a change of command with General Creech. You remain and get your 2nd star. You are the Director of Plans, the Director of Operations, and in July 1981, you're sent to be the commander of the 9th Air Force, which also was the Air Force component of the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force. Now, a little context on that. About a year earlier, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. The Carter administration had proclaimed that the Persian Gulf and threats to the Persian Gulf now were a core interest for the United States, that so-called Carter Doctrine. The Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force had been a concept that had been kicking around, but it had never been fleshed out. Now it became a reality that you needed it. Because if the Soviets made a move toward Persian Gulf oil, the United States planned to counter that, and the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force was the way that it would be countered. Now, the commander of the RDJTF was Marine Corps General P.X. Kelly, who'd been previously the Director of Operations on the Joint Staff when the RDJTF concept was being put together. But he basically had no staff, and there was a Navy 1-star, but he was located in Hawaii, and he had basically no staff. So in addition to just doing the Air Force things, what you're basically doing is putting together the integrated concept, a very complicated logistics concept for how the United States would surge forces, pre-position materials, and things like that in the Persian Gulf area in the case that we got into a shooting war with the Soviet Union. At the end of your time, which was not that long doing that, but it was long enough to basically put together a good part of the integrated concept, you're brought back to Headquarters Air Force in 1982. First of all, programs and resources, then you become the Vice Chief of Staff. Now, you've done almost everything that could have been done in Tactical Air Command up to this point, and you had been terribly innovative. I mean, the T-38 program was yours. Basically, the integrated, the Combat Operations Center that's were created were yours. The integrated concept for air operations. The first F-15 wing. You'd done all those kinds of things.